Hi everyone, welcome back to the series. In this video we're going to look at one more line in the Queen's Gambit declined exchange variation. So here's the Queen's Gambit, and e6 is the Queen's Gambit declined. And the point of that move is Black is adopting what's called a strong point defense. He wants to maintain a pawn on d5, which is controlling the e4 square and stopping White from expanding in the center with pawn to e4. So if White ever takes the pawn on d5, Black is poised to recapture with his pawn and keep control of that square. Alright, so in this position we will play knight to c3, and we looked at two moves here for Black. In the last video in the series we looked at bishop d7. Before that we looked at knight to f6. Let's go back to knight to f6 in this video. All right, here we will exchange pawns on d5. So we'll take on d5, and previously we looked at e takes d5. But here I want to look at knight takes d5. So this is the line today, knight takes d5. It's counterintuitive, and it seems to go against what we were just saying. Black is not replacing his pawn on d5 with another pawn. And that means Black is no longer controlling e4. So he's allowing us to get a strong center. Now the reason Black may want to do this, and it's not the most popular way to play, by far capturing back with the pawn is the most popular way to play. But it is possible to play like this, and what Black is arguing is, go ahead and take the center. I'm going to counterattack it. Black wants to counterattack that center, and he wants to trade a lot of pieces off and try to equalize. All right, well, if you see this move, you should take the space in the center that's being offered. You should push your pawn to e4, and you should be very happy about that. So you have two pawns in the center of the board, got a lot of open lines for your pieces, and you just gained a tempo on the Black knight. All right, that knight does not want to retreat. You can expect everyone to take the knight on c3 in this position. That way White has to recapture and pass the move back to Black, so Black doesn't lose any time in retreating his knight. So we recapture, and we have a strong center, and we even have the d pawn bolstered by the c3 pawn. So we have a lot of central space here, and Black needs to do something about it, and the most popular move by far is c5. That's a very common move in many lines of the Queen's Gambit. So Black strikes back at the White center, and notice he did not block in that pawn with his knight. If he develops that knight, he can develop it behind the pawn, or we will see it actually developed to d7 in this line. So Black wants to exchange a pair of pawns here on d4 and then get his dark squared bishop out. All right, here we're going to play knight to f3, just a sensible developing move, developing the knight to its natural square, defending d4 further, getting closer to kingside castling. And Black's going to go ahead and exchange pawns on d4. So we take back with our pawn, keeping a very nice center. And now players that play this line as Black, they almost always play this next move, bishop to b4 check. It's not a necessity to play this move, but the reason Black plays this is because, again, he's gaining time. He's developing his piece with check, so we have to respond to the check. We're going to block the check. And after we respond, he'll be able to castle quickly. So he's gaining time, but he's also exchanging pieces. And that's important. That's central to Black's plan in this line, is to exchange as many pieces as possible. So we play bishop d2 to block the check, and Black exchanges bishops. We'll take back with the queen, and Black will castle. So why is it that black wants to exchange pieces in this line? Well, white has the strong center, which gives him more space. He can push those pawns forward and gain even more space. But space is really only an asset if you can use it to do something to your opponent. In particular, a strong center often has a cramping influence on your opponent, which means it takes away squares from your opponent's pieces, and the pieces trip over each other, and it gets hard to develop harmoniously when you're facing a strong center like this. For example, imagine a knight on f6. That knight can be attacked with a simple pawn push. Similarly, a knight on c6 can be attacked with a pawn push. These pawns are mobile, they can come forward and start harassing the black pieces. But if you exchange a lot of pieces, then you're not going to be cramped. Your pieces will not be fighting each other for squares or open lines. So that was black's idea, to exchange those pieces off, so the center is not such a big deal. However, in this particular line, I would argue that black is merely trying to draw the game. He's trying to equalize, he's trying to get his pieces developed, and just get a very equal drawish endgame. So I don't think black naturally gets any counter chances in this line to unbalance things and to go for a win. So you have absolutely nothing to worry about as the white player in this particular line of the exchange variation. So it's not something you have to study very much. All right, a lot of games have reached this exact position. Even at the top super grandmaster level, this has been played even in recent years. In fact, Vladimir Kramnik, former world champion, used to play the black side of this. I think he kind of revitalized it and made it playable again, and told the chess world that it's a viable option against the Queen's Gambit. On the other side, I noticed that Magnus Carlsen, current world champion, is very good on the white side of this opening. He has a lot of spectacular wins. He knows what he's doing. He likes the central space. And so what I thought we would do is follow one of Magnus Carlsen's games. And I'm going to look at the game Carlsen versus Anish Giri. And this was played in 2020. Soon after the COVID-19 pandemic started, when there were not any chess tournaments in person. This was an online rapid tournament, and this was the finals of the tournament, which featured Carlsen versus Giri playing a rapid match. All right, so Carlsen has white, and he plays bishop c4 here, getting ready to castle, developing the bishop to a sensible square. The bishop can be vulnerable on c4. It's not defended by anything. Eventually, black will probably get a rook to c8 and gain a tempo on that bishop. But nevertheless, white does not want to put the bishop anywhere else. It's too passive on e2. And on d3, it would be blocking the queen's influence down the d file. And the queen would no longer be defending the d pawn. If it goes to b5, it can be pushed back with an expansion here on black's queen side. So c4 makes sense, and that bishop can fall back to b3 if necessary. So it's a good square, and white's ready to castle. Okay, Giri played knight d7. In the database, I noticed that's the most popular way to develop that knight. Sometimes it does go to c6. But the reason you may want to put it on d7 is because you want to fianchetto the light squared bishop. You want to put your pawn on b6 here and play bishop to b7. And now the knight on d7 will not be in the way of that bishop. You'll have a clear diagonal here to white's e4 pawn. All right, and this knight can also transfer over to the king side if needed. So it's a good way to develop your knight. So Carlsen castles, b6, rook a d1, centralizing the rook, lending further support to the d4 pawn, bishop b7, rook fe1. You may notice that Carlsen decided not to put a rook on the only open file on the board. Usually you want to put your rooks on open files. I think one reason for that is he anticipates black putting a rook on c8 very soon, and he's simply avoiding trades. He's allowing black to have sole control of the c file, and he doesn't fear that. He doesn't see any attack coming down the file, and he doesn't want to trade his rooks. Okay, so rook c8 was played, and it attacks the bishop, so the bishop falls back to b3. Notice that bishop also controls the c2 square, which is important because later on black may want to get his rook down to this second rank, and the bishop controls that square now. Okay, Giri plays rook e8, and now a very nice move, rook e3. We call that a rook lift. When you bring the rook partway up the file like that, it's a rook lift. And the purpose of doing so is so that you can transfer the rook laterally along the rank. So if this knight moves out of the way, the rook can come over to the king side and help with an attack against the black king. Or it might even go to d3 and triple up on the d file. So it's a flexible move. And then knight f6. So Giri does transfer that knight all the way to the king side. And that black king is going to need some defense because Carlsen is going to be attacking it. Okay, and he's going to start right now with an excellent sequence, a novelty idea in this position. You may notice the pawn on e4 is insufficiently defended. It's attacked by both the knight and the bishop, defended only by the rook. And Carlsen deals with that by playing d5. So the bishop is no longer hitting e4. Now, this move may at first look like it's just an offer of a trade of pawns here, and white doesn't seem to be getting much out of it, but Carlsen has a great idea in mind. After Giri takes on d5, Carlsen does not recapture the pawn. He pushes his pawn forward to e5. So he sacrifices a pawn. Why does he do this? Well, he's gaining more space, and by pushing his pawn off of d4, he's just gained that square for his knight. And if he puts his knight here on the next move, that knight is on a great centralized location, and it cannot be driven away, and it's blockading black's passed pawn, which is blocking in his light squared bishop. So Carlsen is giving up a pawn for greater scope for his pieces and for limiting the scope of his opponent's pieces. Okay, and he's just dislodged the knight on f6 as well. So Giri brings that knight forward. Good lesson for beginners: when your pieces get attacked with a pawn like this, think of ways of bringing them forward rather than retreating them. And knight to e4 is possible. It's defended by both the pawn and by the light squared bishop. Okay, so black is attacking the queen at the moment. So Carlsen plays queen e1 to save it, and he's actually threatening something. Okay, if your tactics are sharp, you can see what white is threatening. So white is threatening to take the knight. Rook takes knight. He just moved his queen from d2, and that releases the rook on d1. So the rook on d1 is now facing the black queen. So if white were to take the knight, black would not be able to recapture. The pawn is pinned. He would lose his queen if he did so. So that's the threat. And Giri handles the threat by moving his queen off of the d file. He plays queen c7. Then knight d4 as planned, centralizing the knight, blockading the pawn. That bishop is ineffective at the moment. And Carlsen has a rook already lifted to the third rank. It can come to the king side at any time. So what does Carlsen want to do in this position? Well, he's actually making a threat right now of knight to b5, which attacks the queen. And when the queen moves, he can then sink the knight into d6, a great outpost. An outpost is a square that can't be attacked by enemy pawns, and it's supported by this white pawn on e5. And from d6, the knight would be forking the pair of rooks, notice. So there's actually a threat to win some material with that sequence. White would also like to play f3 to dislodge black's strong knight out of the center. So he moved his knight out of the way so he can do that. He also wants to start attacking the black king. He can move the rook over. He can get the queen into play. He can push his h-pawn, which we're going to see him do, to start attacking that black king. So he has a lot of compensation for the sacrificed pawn. Okay, so at this stage, Giri has to do something about this knight to b5 threat, and he chooses a6 to control that square. Okay, Carlsen responds with h4, pushing his pawn toward the enemy king. That's part of an attack. Pushing your pawns forward like that can be useful, as we will see. Then rook cd8, just defending the pawn, getting the rooks out of that configuration so that he doesn't have to worry about them getting forked from the d6 square. Okay, f3, as promised, he wants to dislodge the knight. The knight goes to c5. It attacks this bishop, but that bishop is not the most important piece to Carlsen in this position. He doesn't anticipate using it in the attack against the black king anytime soon because he wants this pawn to remain there blocking in the light squared bishop. So he's okay if black wants to trade that. So he pushes his pawn to h5, continuing to press on the king side. Giri changes plans with his knight. He drops it back to e6. He would like to trade it off for that knight. That knight is a nuisance to black because it's blockading the passed pawn and keeping the bishop locked in. And he's worried that this knight may participate in an attack against the black king. It can go to f5, for example. All right, in fact, that's what Carlsen does. He does not want to trade the knights. He plays it to f5. Okay, and his plan involves attacking the black king by playing queen to g3, which will put pressure on g7. And he's still eyeing this d6 square. He can move it there if needed during the attack. This pawn is also quite vulnerable. It's attacked twice right now, and Carlsen can attack it further and try to win that isolated pawn. So black is in a bit of a bind here. He's in a lot of pressure. White can play in different ways, and black doesn't have a lot of useful moves. So white is dominating the position. All right, so black plays d4, a double-edged move. He opens the diagonal for his bishop since the knight moved out of the way and allowed that, but he also opens up the diagonal for Carlsen's bishop here. Okay, and this pawn is now a little bit weaker because it's not defended by the light squared bishop anymore. So Carlsen may be able to win that pawn. Okay, he plays rook e d3 to save his rook, which was under attack by the pawn. Then knight c5, attacking the rook, and incidentally the bishop, which is defended. Okay, but he's given up his d-pawn here, so Carlsen takes it. But he does it because the reason Giri does this is because he wants to exchange some pieces off in anticipation of being attacked. He doesn't want Carlsen to have so many attacking units. So Giri exchanges rooks on d4, and then he takes the bishop off the board. Okay, I'll point out before here that black looks like he might be able to win this e5 pawn since it's only defended once and it's attacked twice. But there's a tactical reason he cannot take that pawn. Do you see why that pawn is poisoned? Yes, it's because of black's weak back rank, we say. You've got a weak back rank if your king is behind a wall of pieces like these 3 pawns here and it has no escape off the back rank. White has no such issue. He does not have a weak back rank. And his back rank is only defended by 1 piece at the moment. So he has to watch out for checkmates on that back rank. So if black did something like rook takes e5, Carlsen could actually just take that rook, offering the queen, because if black takes the queen, he's going to get mated like this. So that pawn is untouchable. And so Giri takes the bishop on b3 instead. And now a nice little intermediate move, intermezzo, Zwischenzug, it's got a lot of names. Queen g3, rather than recapturing the knight, Carlsen is threatening checkmate. Queen takes g7 checkmate. Now, this pawn's still untouchable. You may be thinking, can Giri take the pawn with the queen at this point and defend g7? Yeah, that defends against queen takes g7 checkmate, but it does not defend against this checkmate. So that pawn is still untouchable. So what Giri does in this position is play g6 so that the queen cannot deliver a mate. Okay, then Carlsen takes the piece back on b3, and then rook d8 is played. And this is really the big blunder in the position. The engine screams that this is terrible, but it was a pretty bad position anyway. I'm looking at the engine right now, and it says white is up plus 2.6, so almost a 3-pawn advantage. But after this move, white is up about plus 8, okay, almost a full queen advantage, according to the engine. So we're going to discuss why that's such a big blunder. And I wanted to point out the very interesting engine move that was suggested here. And I don't know if Giri saw this move or not, or if he considered it. It was only a rapid game. But he could have tried bishop takes f3, setting a little trap. So kind of a weird move, just out of nowhere, just taking a pawn that's well defended. But here's the point. Capturing that bishop either way is a mistake. If white captures with the queen, black can take the knight. And this is actually a pretty equal endgame here. He could not take the knight before, I should mention, because it's pinned by the queen. Okay. But after this, bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, now the knight can be taken. And there's a more subtle reason why white should not take with the pawn. It's because of this move, queen to c1 check. And whichever of the 3 squares the king walks up to in this position, black's going to play queen to c2 check and fork the king and the knight. King will move somewhere and black will pick up the knight with his queen. And this position is actually better for black. Black has got a good advantage here. He's a pawn up and he's also threatening both of these pawns. All right, so what would Carlsen have done if Giri had found this strange computer move, bishop takes f3? Well, he would have kept his commanding position by playing rook to c4. So he's attacking the queen and he's stopping the queen from getting down to c1, checking the white king. So then after the queen is moved to safety somewhere, then we can play even stronger than taking the bishop. You can play knight to d6 here, blocking up the d file, attacking the rook, and the bishop is still under attack. So white is dominating in this position. Okay, so going back to the game, Giri did not play that funny engine move. He instead played rook to d8, and the engine says this is terrible. And here's the reason. If this queen were not defending the rook, if the queen were somewhere else, then rook takes d8 would be checkmate. Notice how the knight has the escape square in g7 covered. So what white could do is try to decoy the queen, which means try to drive it off from defending that rook. And let's see how Carlsen does it. He does it with quite a brilliant move here. Maybe pause the video and try to find that move. Okay, Carlsen played e6. Okay, great move. He's attacking the queen. He just revealed an attack on the queen, which is undefended. And of course, Giri cannot take Magnus's queen because of the back rank checkmate here. So he has to do something about the attack on his queen. Let's look at a couple of possibilities. If he plays queen to b8, so the rook is defending the queen and the queen is defending the rook here, strengthening the back rank, then there are actually a lot of ways white can win here. The engine actually announces a checkmate in 6 moves, and there are multiple checkmates in 6 moves. One of them begins with queen to e5. Strange move going right towards the black queen like that. And the queen is undefended, but again, black cannot take it because of the back rank mate. And so this queen is threatening to come to g7 with mate. So what if black takes the knight? Okay, well, in that case, we have h6, and the pawn is now defending this square. So again, if the queen takes, there's a back rank mate. So the pawn is now playing the role of the knight, and white is still threatening an unstoppable checkmate here on g7. Black might block with f6. You can take the pawn, or you can even mate faster by dropping the queen back to g3. King f8, check, and mate. So queen to b8 doesn't work in this position, and what Giri tried instead was queen to c1 check. Okay, Carlsen tucks his king away, and then Giri takes the rook on d4. But now here's the point of Carlsen's move e6. When Carlsen played e6, he must have seen this sequence of queen to c1 check followed by rook takes d4. He must have seen this position, and he had to have the following idea in mind. e7. Brilliant move, e7 here. Just threatening to queen the pawn and deliver checkmate on the back rank. It's very hard to stop that pawn. The rook cannot come behind it to stop because there's a pawn here. It can't come up here to stop. The pawn would take. The queen cannot come here. Queen has that covered. Can't go there either. The knight has that covered. So there's a few tries here. You could bring the queen either to c6 to defend the queening square, or you can bring it to c8 to defend the queening square. Or you might try defending with the bishop, but that doesn't work. That just gives white a mate in 3, beginning with queen to b8 check, the rook blocks, and check, bishop blocks, and mate. Okay, so the queen has to either move to c6 or c8, and c8 makes the most sense because it's going all the way to the back rank, trying to protect the back rank, and that's what Giri played. If he had played queen to c6, then there's always knight takes the rook, and at that point there's even a threat of queen to b8 check here. So maybe the queen has to fall back to e8 or maybe c8 to defend that. Then there's queen to d6. Okay, bishop c8, h6, bishop d7. At that point, there's a threat of queen to d8. So bishop d7 blocks that, but queen f6 threatening a mate here on g7. So there's really nothing black could have done. So going back to the game, Giri tried queen to c8. Then queen to e5 was played with a double attack. There's an attack on the rook, and there's a mate threat on g7. There's also a mate threat, knight to h6 would be mate as well. So there's nothing Giri can really do to stop all of this. He played one last move, rook to h4 check, maybe hoping Carlsen would take with the knight, which would break up his mate threats here, so he wouldn't be able to do one of the two mates. But Carlsen just coolly sidesteps with his king to g3, and now Giri resigned. So you can't defend against everything in the position. He's threatening this mate, he's threatening this mate, he's even threatening queening his pawn, followed by mate on e8. So, and he's threatening the rook, so there's nothing Giri can do. All right, so spectacular game by Carlsen, who shows you exactly how to play that particular line. So just to summarize, what you should remember in this position, if black takes back with the knight instead of the pawn, is you want the huge center. You want to push that pawn, gain a tempo. You've got a great center here. You just want to develop your pieces to their natural squares. You want to get castled kingside. You can expect c5, knight f3. Black may exchange some stuff here, but you're still in the driver's seat. I would say white is the only one with winning chances in this particular position. Of course, it's still a chess game. It's still not too far from being an equal position, so you have to play it well. It's not going to win itself. It's not going to be as easy to win as Carlsen just showed us, but you're holding all the cards. You have the space, you have the center, all your pieces are on ideal squares, so there's really nothing to fear in this line. All right, thanks for watching. We're going to go ahead to the Queen's Gambit Accepted in our next videos in the series. Hope to see you for the next one.